Koka sunarai sunarayanti. 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 Koka sunarai sunarayanti.
Hello, hi, welcome to this new episode of the Mango TV podcast. Today I'm very excited to have Dimitri Mugianis. Dimitri is a noted harm reduction advocate, psychedelic practitioner, musician, writer, community organizer, and he revolutionized heroin addiction treatment in the US using Ibogaine, despite its legal status. His unique approach combined traditional Ibogaine ceremony elements with Western medical safety protocol highlighted in the documentary I Am Dangerous with Love. His work has garnered global research interest and acceptance in some medical circles. Mujanis has conducted over 500 Ibogaine ceremonies and thousands using sound, art, psychedelic like psilocybin and MDMA, focusing on psychological healing and spiritual awakening. With 20 years in the psychedelic field, he is recognized for his expertise and contribution to harm reduction co-founding a holistic program on New York harm reduction educator, NYHRE. He integrates various therapies for marginalized groups, demonstrating his commitment to innovative and compassionate care. Welcome, Dimitri.
Hey, brother, how are you?
Nice to have you.
Glad to be here.
You were such a precursor, right? That documentary was so controversial. I'm Dangerous with Love. Which year did it come out? At IFC, I remember.
I just saw the filmmaker 2 days ago, Michel Negroponte, and we started filming 20 years ago. And I think it came out 16 years ago or 15 years ago. It's hard for me to remember. But yeah, at a time when there wasn't this sort of mainstreaming of psychedelics. So it was something.
Yeah, this craze. I remember, my wife Stephanie, that you know well also, she was telling me that when she was start doing ayahuasca in 2005, 20 years ago, she would go to Peru and it was like, there was no hipster and trend. It was like the end of the line. It's like people that either I do this or I die or something.
I prefer that actually, because same with me, basically, the end of the line people. Yeah, man. Yeah.
Yeah, now it's a lot of like cocktail party discussion. But anyhow, we'll get there. Let's I was telling you off the record that in our podcast we talk about things really out there, but we keep a quite conservative structure. We like the past, present, future. So let's start from where did you grow up? What was your first connection with this medicine or maybe drugs? Tell us a little bit about your biography.
Sure. I'm Greek American. I grew up in Detroit, born in 1962. So coming into sort of young adulthood, teenage, adolescent years in the early 70s, mid 70s. Detroit in the 70s was quite a place for a lot of reasons. I mean, there always has been this incredible cultural, musical stream in Detroit. I was a young musician. I started playing in punk bands. Eventually, got involved in other scenes and house and all kinds of other scenes. But I played in punk bands in my early teens when I was in just a kid really. I started playing in nightclubs at 14. I had some dysfunction around the house. These days we call it trauma. But it was just like Tuesday, right? so
how did you call it back then? Just normal life?
Yeah, it was like Tuesday, right? It was Tuesday afternoon, right? So I just have a diagnosis eventually of dyslexia, so I couldn't really read or write till I was 15 or 16. I was in the Detroit public school systems, which was not a great system. Violence was, sort of around me. There was some issues at home. I found, my house was a leftist house. I know you have some experience growing up with, parents or step parents that have a similar way of looking at things, not a liberal, but a leftist home.
Mhm.
And so it was very sort of akin to what I hear people talking about growing up in a fundamentalist household.
Mhm.
There was a very sense of right and wrong and sin and guilt. And, I consider myself still a leftist, so I'm grateful for that. But as a kid, that was kind of heavy. And then there was there's violence around and sexual abuse as a kid. And arts were always encouraged in my home. And I found my refuge in, as Lou Reed wrote, his life was saved by rock and roll. So I found refuge in music and in drugs. And I started getting high at a very young age, maybe 11 or 12.
On what? On
Well,
what?
cannabis, alcohol, glue, which like is a whole spiritual pursuit. Drugs were just everywhere back then. I mean, just everywhere. Even the squarest kid was tripping or something. And that was, like sort of like my older cousins and brothers, the older kids in the neighborhood were hippies. We were just left with the just the drugs, right? And then, the punk movement came on and I started playing in nightclubs. But I was kind of high on something from 11 till 39 on the cusp of 40. That's the right reaction. It's the laugh. It's like, what the fuck, right? But but at first it was a couple things. It was a numbing of pain, but it was also an exploration. And not that I was taking psychedelics I did do psychedelics. It'd be a mismatch of PCP and acid and Colt 45, and the back of a Pinto, right? Eventually I found my way to opiates and cocaine, which was a whole other thing. I eventually moved out of Detroit and came to where I wanted to come all my life. I was playing music and I came to New York in I guess the early 80s, maybe 80 or 81. And I started playing nightclubs here, and I started meeting all these artists and activists, and became really involved with like the old beatniks. I was a dear friend of Herbert Huncke and Gregory Corso, and I was less close to Ginsberg, but those folks were really essential in my life. I lived with Herbert Huncke, the great Huncke the Junkie, for a while, and was just on the Lower East Side, and the habit grew. So it went from this numbing of pain and expansion to and sort of pushing an envelope to like sort of the exact opposite. I became, the ultimate consumer.
But wait, let me go back 1 second to Detroit. But so because you mentioned, okay, so cannabis, alcohol, glue. I mean, I can see how some of this, substance were numbing, but then you mentioned LSD. But so I imagine there was mushroom. But so you didn't feel the expansion and the optimism for the connection with the cosmos? Not yet.
Well, it's hard to remember, but I will say this, that I had some profound experiences on LSD as a kid. But I was combining so many things to try to trace it. It wasn't as if I had this awakening at 14 or 16 off of those drugs. Not that I remember, but I was consuming quite a bit of different drugs in insane combinations. There were moments I can remember, I can recall. I used to set the clock. I remember maybe I was 16 and we were working on writing some material for a record, and I would set my clock an hour before I was supposed to wake up to take acid. That way I would wake up and just be tripping through the day, which I don't know if that's best practices, John Hopkins, or not, but it was effective for me at the time. But, I can point to the moment I first used heroin as a moment of, in some ways, a transformative moment. And that's not to romanticize it or anything, but a release of pain. But that I can remember very clearly. The first opiate I did.
In that was New York.
But I didn't do opiates till I got to New York. And that was New York, and in almost a cliche, but it was at the Hotel Chelsea, where I lived on and off for, I don't know, maybe 15 years. Yeah.
So, like you smoked it the first time,
The
heroin?
first time I snorted heroin, and I was with a friend of mine from Detroit who came with me, a young artist who eventually died, as so many people did. Um, but my friend Paul Hodge and I got some heroin, and he eventually didn't survive it, and somehow I did, which is also part of my story. I don't know why, given the trajectory. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. They said that the only time that they ever saw Timothy Leary being calm is after he did the heroin. They say it's really like like the embrace and the soup of a loving mother you never had, something like that. I mean, you hear very beautiful story of junkie saying that why I keep on doing it, because it makes me feel like my mother bringing me a soup. Do you
Yeah.
remember that?
Well, yeah. There's also, I think there's a maybe it's Sanskrit, or I think it's part of a meditative practice, but this idea of home, this idea of finally being home, away from anxiety, and I guess Mother Soup is a really good way of
Yeah,
looking at it. It is a Faustian deal, though.
yeah.
It gives
Because
some.
then you get hooked.
You can get hooked. Well, I remember the beat poet Gregory Corso I just mentioned. Maybe I was in my early 20s, and he was probably in his 60s. And he said, and he was just a brilliant guy, but also a pain in the ass and character, and a lovely guy too. But I remember him saying, he had this thick Brooklyn accent. He says, "Well, kid, you got a friend for life." And I remember just the sinking feeling around that. But I was using heroin for 20 years, and at first, it was really great. Um, it was great, actually, sexually at first. I mean, for many years, it was really. I could create on it. I could stay up and write. I could perform, go out on stage after, perform on it. Um, And so, I always say, like, talking badly about it is like talking bad about your ex-wife. Like, again, I don't want to romanticize it, because I've seen so much death around me
Yeah,
as a
yeah,
result
yeah.
of it, but and suffering and pain that I caused other folks. But at first it worked so damn well. And as a anti-anxiety, antidepressive, it worked well, but then it started to take more than it gave, and the expansion that drugs in general gave started becoming smaller. My deal was, eventually I was mixing it with cocaine on a daily basis, injecting it, and so I was in psychosis for years, a good deal of the time. Um, and Yeah, I mean, I could talk about those times as well if you like. Those were the 80s in New York, and there was lots of death around HIV/AIDS. And
Mm,
I don't know if you're in the city then or not,
no, no.
but certain neighborhoods, including Lower Manhattan, which I was in, was there were epicenters of HIV/AIDS at that time, and it would be Lower Manhattan and parts of very overly exploited, what folks call third world country. I call them overly exploited countries, like this, where HIV was just sort of. It was one of the. I'll just say it's one of the red zones around the world, and so many people were dying.
Yeah.
Queer friends and family, and then I don't know what the rate of infection for intravenous drug users were, but a very high rate, maybe 4 in 10 or something like that.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah. It was like a massacre. I remember this documentary. What was the third friend? It was like the three of them: Basquiat, Keith Haring, and the third guy who does all the colorful blog. Anyhow, he was living with Keith Haring. I was part of a documentary about him, and he says that from one day to the next, there was like everybody was dying.
yeah, and you mentioned those artists. I mean, there was also this explosion of art that was happening simultaneously in the midst of all that. So it was quite a time to be in New York and to be young, and in many ways great, but also, you know, uh, not to overemphasize it, especially in these times, but with what's happening in the world and how much suffering through violence is happening right now. But to be young and experience that much death around you was akin to being in a war, just in terms of the numbers of people that you saw dying.
Yeah. But so there was a moment. So when did you meet Iboga? When you were like desperate, or
This is about transformation. I should mention the lead up to that. I say harm reduction like everybody knows it, because
yeah,
I've been around it. But just really briefly, harm reduction is a movement that came from that era, where we were seeing so many people dying. So harm reduction at its very base would be to give people information and access to ways to keep them safe from disease, and so the reduction of harm from the use of drugs and other practices, including sexual practices, right?
yeah,
And so there was a movement to make access to syringe and clean what we called works, spoon and all that kind of stuff,
uh-huh.
which was illegal to possess. So, and it was one of the main routes of infection. So a whole movement grew up around that, right? Along with these folks from ACT UP, which were queer activists. And so my awareness of harm reduction sort of grew at the same time as my awareness of Iboga, because they were in the little sort of subculture of the Lower East Side at that time. They were sort of coming up together. And so my first awareness of harm reduction as a movement and Iboga through the same scene was I was on the Lower East Side at this place called the Gas Station, which I was playing at on a sort of like a house band there. It's an old gas station. It was incredible which was just sculpture park. It was insane. It was beautiful.
Nice.
Second Street and B, and
Yeah.
very different Second Street and B. And I would go and get my syringes there, which were sold on the street for $1 or $2, right? But the thing is that even if they were sealed, you would open them up often and a little water would come out. So you would try to bleach it, which is, but the reality was I was risking my life every time I injected. And I was at a very low point in my life, and very sort of dejected. And I came up on that corner where there are usually folks selling those works, those syringes, and there was a table there, and it was a bunch of queer guys. We called them gay back then, or they started calling themselves queer. Actually, it was
Hmm.
like, "We're here, we're queer, get used to it." But it was ACT UP, and I recognized the pink triangle, and they had a little table there, and they and some literature in these bags, and they handed me a bag full of clean syringes and some literature, and it I tell this story a lot, but I'm never not moved by the telling, because it was such a pivotal moment for me. Because it was these guys, they weren't drug users, they were gay men who were there, and they were risking arrest. And they handed me these syringes, and I asked them how much it was, and they said it was free.
Uh-huh.
And they said, I remember one guy, I'll never forget him. He said, "I just want you to be safe."
Yeah.
And so that moment is still moving for me. And that got me into the harm reduction movement, which also, I'm sorry, I didn't go on about that. I'll just say it also got me into the drug policy movement.
Yeah. No, but that's beautiful. So the harm reduction movement was provided by the participant, not by any association, government.
No, actually, it was illegal. And much like psychedelics, and much like even 12 steps, all that is started by the actual users. It's a
Yeah.
grassroots movement, and then the academics try to catch up, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so, and so, uh, these were just actually people affected. So there were a lot of drug users. Many of the harm reduction agencies that are now institutions in New York or other places, and certainly in Spain and in Portugal. I mean, for sure in Portugal, were started by drug users.
Recovering sober. I mean, I would imagine if someone starts to devote their time and energy to reduce harm, probably he has stopped doing harm on himself.
Here's the interesting thing, brother. No,
No.
a lot of these people were active addicts with habits. I can tell you stories about going into eventually a funded place, and the people who are the executive directors would be high but still functional, which depends on, which is also a myth of drugs, is that you always are dysfunctional. My drug use did become dysfunctional, did become harmful, particularly the combination of cocaine injected, right? But there were plenty of users who founded this movement, who came up with best practices outside of institutions and universities. And that's the way the Iboga movement came about too. This was, with all respect, Iboga Ibogaine in the West. Iboga goes back for centuries in Central Africa and Gabon. But the way I first found out about the therapeutic anti-addictive properties of Ibogaine was with other activists on the Lower East Side.
But maybe explain the difference between Iboga and Ibogaine.
Iboga is the plant; it's the root. It's the second layer of the root bark of the Iboga plant.
That grows in equatorial Africa, so Gabon,
Cameroon, a little bit, but mainly in Gabon. It's basically sawdust, and Ibogaine is the hydrochloride. So what coca leaf is to cocaine, just sort of crudely put,
I see.
Ibogaine is to Iboga.
The active component like psilocybin, DMT.
Yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of other things happening in the Iboga plant, and so, but Ibogaine has been used more for the cessation of, for addiction interruption.
Of withdrawal, yeah.
Yeah. So when I first heard about it, I was shooting dope Lower East Side on 10th Street with a guy named Adam Nodelman, who's now dead, who's a dear friend of mine. And he was telling me about this amazing treatment he did in Holland, even though he was injecting heroin, which is sort of crucial to the story because there's a lot of hype around this. The reality is most people relapse. That doesn't take away from how amazing it was. But he told me about that, and I think that was 91, maybe. And he was with his wife at the time, Herta, who was an activist in the squatters movement in both in New York and in Amsterdam. And I was there with my common law wife, who's also now dead. So we were injecting, and they were telling me this amazing story about this plant that they had done maybe 4 months ago, and they were going to go back and do it again.
But where in Holland it was not legal back then, was it?
I think it was in that sort of gray zone,
Yeah.
and there was an organization, part of the Junkie Bund, the Junkie Union, which was a union of drug users, one of the first in the world. Nico Adrian was his name, and he was doing it. And Howard Lutzoff, who became my friend and mentor, was the person that was sort of spearheading this. He was the one sort of serendipitously found Ibogaine on the Lower East Side in 1962, and he was a young morphine addict and sort of a filmmaker, and he just had, because they were tripping on all kinds of things, and he took it, and it's a beautiful story that people can find out, but Howard realized at 19 years old that there was something in this. And then it wasn't just any 19-year-old junkie. He was a 19-year-old junkie who was sort of nerdy and brilliant. And he began this whole movement. So it comes from drug users. And then Howard started using it on friends of his in his circle and started to record what had happened to them. And from that, the Ibogaine movement in the West, that's the origin story for Iboga. But if you think about the possibilities of how the hell did this drug that no one had ever done, and very few people in the West, end up in this particular drug user's hands, and then they bring it and start this movement. And so then for many years, this was a drug user propelled movement, sort of a self-help, self-actualization movement.
And so you heard about it, some people had it, and so for the first time you tried.
I went to Holland. I was 39 years old. I'd gone from playing at nightclubs and hanging out with my heroes to back to my parents' house in the basement in Detroit.
Uh-huh.
And I was parking cars for a living and hustling and just, shooting a couple $100 worth of cocaine and heroin a day. My life had become very small. My common law wife had died pregnant. I was not creating. I was just living in the basement. And, I knew about this stuff. And this is flash forward 10 years, I guess 2001 or two. I got to get the dates right. But I was just, actually, I'm Greek American, as I said. I had a desire to go to Greece, but I had a habit. I couldn't travel. And I hadn't been in 30 years, and I just wanted to go, So I thought, my first thought every day was killing myself. My last thought every night was killing myself. And I thought, I'll go to Greece and I'll come back and die, but I need to do the Iboga. And so we got in touch with the activist Dana Beal, former hippie, who's a creative madman. And right now he's looking at some jail time, and I hope that turns out good for him. But Dana has been an activist in this world. So we reached out to him. And eventually, my family, who doesn't have a lot of money, put some money together, was going to go down to Florida, but someone who became my mentor, Richie Oglovnik, suggested, don't come to me. He said, go to Sarah Glatt in Holland. And so and that way you can go to Greece. So I was getting on the plane. I was making preparations to go to Amsterdam with $1,500 in my pocket. And my brother thought, you're not going to Amsterdam with money. They'll never see me again, right? Back then it was like the Mecca of heroin, supposedly,
What was the Mecca of heroin? Holland?
Yeah, Holland, there was this idea of Amsterdam.
Yeah.
And then the idea was to go to Greece and stay for a few weeks and then come back and die. That was my plan.
But that's so funny. So you were not on a mission to get sober with Iboga. You just wanted to be able to arrive in Greece.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, interesting because how much we know. Now my consciousness around ancestry has been expanded, and the Bwiti, which is the spiritual tradition that surrounds Iboga use in Gabon and parts of Cameroon, is a deeply ancestral spirituality, and about ancestral healing. So the pull was to go to my ancestors, and that was it, because I was hungry for it.
But why you didn't want to heal? Why you wanted to die?
It was beyond my comprehension. I have a company now, a psychedelic company called Cardea. My co-founder, Dr. Ross Ellenhorn, talks about fear of hope. And I think I was in a space that I was too fearful of hope. There's too much death. I've been through a drug 30, 40, 50, I don't know how many times. I've been on methadone. I've been trying. So that idea has just seemed beyond, to tell you the truth, for me, Giancarlo, I don't know if I had a desire to heal. I had a desire to be released from pain, but I was stuck in sort of a Chinese, the finger torture about trying to pull, by pulling on the heroin would just embed me further in the pain. And so there was something unconscious, but I didn't believe it.
Yeah.
I didn't believe it because it sounds like snake oil.
Yeah.
Right? I just wanted to take a break, have something help me with the withdrawal, and for some reason, just to go to my ancestral home and go to the village of my grandmother. So at least in that, look, I was a drug user, but I was still, reading and interested and listening to music and interested in, and I knew that there was a pull that I had to answer, and it was for my family. It was, at that time they didn't have a lot of money, so everyone sort of pooled money together. They're actually happy to get rid of me, and so I arrived at this farmhouse outside of Amsterdam.
Yeah. And
I was expecting, I didn't know her last name was Glatt. I was expecting Sarah with blonde hair, but this dark woman with frizzy hair showed up, an Israeli woman, and it was Sarah Glatt. And she has 6 kids. It was this farmhouse, sort of a hippie. She's smoking weed the whole time. And that's where I did my session. Actually, I was on cocaine, methadone, and heroin, and I got really drunk on the airplane. So I was drunk when I first took Iboga.
You were drunk on what?
There was a free bar, international flight. I hadn't been on an international flight in my adult life. And so I accepted the challenge of a free bar,
And so you get your first session, your first dose of Ibogaine.
Yeah,
I'm not familiar with the dosage. How much is a classical dose?
because my practice, I haven't detoxed, drug users, addicts for a number of years. I moved away from that. We can talk about that later. My
Yeah.
practice now is here at Cardea, but also with psilocybin and MDMA. That's been my work. But so interestingly enough, this was Iboga, was actually something called Indra, which is a derivative of Iboga, and it was Sarah who is, and I say this with the respect that the term should, she's a witch. Okay. And so what she did was very unscientific. She did a kinesiology test on me. So I don't know what. So back in the day, with Ibogaine, we measured milligrams per kilogram of body weight.
I
There would
see.
be maybe 18 milligrams over the course of 24 hours. You could do 2,400 milligrams per kilogram for what they call a flood dose and an interruption. But nowadays, things have changed. And the fact that I was on methadone, they would never detox anyone on methadone now. We know that the half-life of methadone is so long. But what Sarah did with a joint hanging out of her mouth and a bunch of kids running around and a fucking windmill in the background, which was blowing me away. I was just running around the streets of Detroit the night before. Fucking windmill. She put some iboga in my hand, and she did a kinesiology test, and that's what I took. And that started. I was in her daughter's bedroom. Her daughter must be a woman in her 30s now, but she was a teenager. So there were pop stars on the wall and and a little bed, and and I started the experience, which lasted 3 days. The thing with addiction,
Wow.
especially back then, is that you have to redose. So there's a myth out there that all Iboga lasts all this time. If you're doing a spiritual or initiatory dose of Iboga, you could be under for several days, but the bulk of that lasts, let's say, 12 to 18 hours, and then there's a recovery time. The thing about it back then is what they would do is they would readdress the withdrawal. Well, I should say this: the miracle happens. Your first miracle is when you're given a small test dose of Iboga or Ibogaine, and you're in the beginning of withdrawals, because you need to be in the beginning of withdrawal. So runny nose, runny eyes, and a small test dose is given, and your withdrawal is goes away or low. And so there's something without the psychedelic effect. So there's folks now that are working on protocols that don't involve a deep psychedelic experience. But for me, you have, and so sometimes the withdrawal would come back, and so you'd have to be given more Iboga 20 hours later, or 18 or 38 hours later, which is the last thing you want to do. Even those of us who can you imagine having the life-changing psychedelic moment of ayahuasca, and you're coming out of it and says, okay, time for some more. It's like, no, don't send me back there. So that was part of the process. So I was in that room for 3 days, and I lost track of. I tried to keep track of daylight and sundown and sun up. My brother would come in and check on me. She'd come and check. Their kids. There was a little 4-year-old boy. Again, he must be a man now. He would come in, and little Brahm was his name, and he was actually sort of my guide in a way, because he heard me suffering. But I was vomiting and weeping, and it was so hard to articulate. But what was happening there is that I was sick, but I was not in withdrawal, because I was not craving. I was sick from the detox, but I wasn't craving. I could have found my way to Amsterdam and gotten really good heroin. I had no desire.
Nice.
There's no locked doors, right? And I got to say something. As I say that, this is my experience, but it's not everyone's experience. And that was a mistake I made, which I'll get to in a bit. But I had no desire for it. I was able to, in that time, to process the death of my wife, who died pregnant, and I felt tremendous amounts of guilt about.
Uh-huh.
And I realized my mistakes in that, but I also realized it wasn't me that did that. And the release from that was enough. I didn't care. That was enough. And that's something I realized later, which was when you go for detoxing and that doesn't work, people relapse. But even if I relapsed and I didn't walk around with that false sense of guilt, there's guilt which is healthy and there's toxic guilt. I knew what I did. I wish I had done some things differently, but I didn't cause her death, right, or the death of my unborn child, right. So I was able to mourn that. I was able to at least begin the process and the recognition of sexual abuse as an adolescent, as violence in my home and on the street. I was able to process that and also sort of go through what the harm that I had done in the course of that 20 years of addiction. That and foreseeing the future, like sort of like incredible. I mean, I saw like very detailed. For instance, I used to let the show This American Life. I knew that I was going to be on that show and that I was going to be doing Iboga.
You saw that in
I saw the actual that particular show. I saw that.
how many years beforehand?
Oh, 8 years, 6 years, something like that.
Yeah.
I saw my teacher in Gabon, in Africa, Papa Andre, appeared to me.
That you didn't know yet.
No, that I did not know yet.
But so let's try to break this down. I know it's difficult, but so what's the closest scientific explanation did you find to explain all this phenomenon? So from the elimination of the withdrawn, from reconciliation with guilt, and from visionary experience. That's a tricky one. I mean, how did you did you put them away as mystery and that's it, or did you?
I think, when there's a mystery and we try to impose logos over it, I think we do ourselves disservice. Of course, we want to find out.
But for you,
For me, I got to say that I was raised by leftist atheists, but I always had a deep longing for God.
Mhm.
And I think my use of heroin, my attraction to the arts, my attraction to a certain form of sort of lefty politics have to do with a longing for God, and a longing for a connection with spirit, God. And so I had experiences before which were unexplainable. The fact that I was alive was unexplainable. The fact that I was, have a liver intact and all my teeth, it's unexplainable. So I would walk with these miracles, and I would think about God and read about it and listen to gospel or Greek Orthodox chants, and this was my, or Alice Coltrane or whoever, a desire to connect. So to me, I simply accepted it
as a
and
miracle, as a miracle.
as a miracle and without question. And then, as I came out of that, that's how I've lived my life. I don't seek an explanation. It's not the way I think. I am grateful to the reductionism of the scientific reductionism. I understand we've achieved so many things, but I think there's a point where you're not going to be able to explain that I saw the future. I don't even talk about it that much because it's so fucking crazy, but there's a lot of shit I don't talk about anymore because I just see it and I move through it. Even the interruption of the withdrawal and my desire to use is not, and there's people who can talk about it. I find it okay, it's interesting, but it's not the thing I'm interested in. I just know it as a fact. I know that I walked in, let's say, on a Thursday and then woke up on Monday and I had no desire to use
Yeah.
heroin
Do
or
you
cocaine.
do you know if Ibogaine is a tryptamines?
I
Do you
don't
know
even
that?
know, my brother. Yeah, I don't even know.
Okay, it doesn't it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. But some people, this is the eternal conversation I have with my wife. It's like, some people have this cognitive curiosity and need to understand things to then metabolize and digest them and feel them. What I'm trying to say is that, the neuropsychopharmacological study done on the tryptamines, on psilocybin, for example, they saw that it reduced the blood supply in this default mode network, right? So, which is the prefrontal cortex, the thalamus, and the medial cortex, something like that. Michael Pollan, on his book, he says that the default mode network is the closest thing to our egoic armor.
Hmm.
So this idea that when the tryptamines reduce the blood supply and the egoic armor gets subdued, then your true essence, your true authentic self, your true, your soul can then appear from this, tightening for this egoic armor, right? So with that explanation, we can explain the processing of the guilt. We can also explain, this, the desire of self-harm to be subdued. This is a new understanding of ourself, right? When also the egoic armor, also Michael Pollan call it the director of the brain, right? The director of the orchestra of the brain. So when the director gets subdued, all the different parts of the brain for the first time can express themselves without the story of the biography of the sexual abuse of, so all this for me, for a cognitive hungry person like me, I can get it. But what, it's still a mystery but I want to crack it, is how can you see a show 8 years in advance, and how can you meet your Iboga teacher from Gabon how many years in advance?
Something like that. 5 years. I don't know, man. I'm bad with them. 4 years, 5 years, six. I don't know. Something like that, man. Yeah.
Anyhow, I know it's not, this cognitive exploration doesn't rock your boat, and I want to talk about.
No, 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 brother. I appreciate it. So when you say it, I'm here, I'm listening to someone's belief system. I
Yeah.
don't place it anywhere above or below any creation theory or belief system, but it's a way for you to understand the world. But I think we are just, you're saying it this way, and I'm saying God, and it makes everything you're talking about sounds to me as the mechanism of a divine or higher consciousness. And so it's like, and then you get to a mystery, and science says we haven't explained that yet. I mean, do we know what's happening in the brain? And by the way, if we want that to happen with psilocybin, in order to reproduce that, then you need an MRI machine, right? Along with some gongs and
Yeah.
maybe, you know what I mean? So I find it interesting. It's not where my mind goes.
Yeah. Let my mind goes there for 2 minutes.
Mhm.
And then I want to talk about all the good work that you're doing today, because you're such a inspiring example of how to turn a complicated condition into a power to do well, to help so many people. And but just allow me to try to have a little bit of a, not a scientific, but some sort of a explanation of this idea of be able to look at the future. So, like in the West, we have this scientific materialism, right? So we believe that matter, this 6 pounds brain, has created consciousness. And in the West, we believe that the big cosmos is a big gigantic clock, that all these things, all these planets, they all move around mechanically. You can predict them. They all have their own pattern and their own motion, and you can predict them. And we are just part of this big mechanism, and we are independent, and we're not connected. And but then what's happening now, and that's the part that excites me the most, that I've been exploring as much as possible with my guests, is that there is a new, there's a change of paradigm. There is a bunch of new people, like the East has been saying forever, that say this whole thing is not a gigantic clock, it's alive. It's an organism. It's like a gigantic organism, and we are part of this organism. And we are not independent observer, because even quantum science and quantum mechanics, they see the double slit experiment, the entanglement, like a subatomic particle connected and then separated and moved 10,000 miles away, behave exactly in the same way. It's faster than the speed of light. So Einstein was wrong. And then the double slit experiment, you see the observer effect. There's not such a thing of objective reality. Just by looking at you, I change the subatomic structure of your body. So what and people say, but what do you care about this intellectual masturbation between, Newtonian Cartesian materialist and people with faith? Why do you care? But I care because I feel that this planet is at this impasse of polarization and greed, because we don't feel connected with something infinite. if our scientific paradigm would like start looking more at the fact that, we might be part of something infinite and we might be all, really connected, I think that can be, a good incentive for maybe treat us a little bit with a little bit more kindness.
Yes, yes to all that. It interests me. It moves me, and especially the way you frame it. Because if any of this is just bullshit, meeting your ancestors is bullshit. Figuring out, the way that we're changing each other molecularly, if we're treating someone poorly on the subway, and if we're coming back, there's only one fucking thing we're talking about, right? What you brought it back to, and it's I'll just, I'll say it. It's just love.
Yeah.
If I could love myself more, a little bit more today, and if we can find that connection, and so we're pointing towards the same space. We're pointing, and I find all that fascinating. What you talk to me, it's instead of explaining away, it's expanding the mystery, and we're going to live in mystery. And us as modern people, our problem is how do we live in mystery? How do we live in uncertainty when so much has been sort of removed, the certain guideposts which are both oppressive but also grounding, right? The church, the state, all these things begin to crumble. And so, man, that's the way you described it, very poetic, by the way, and beautiful. It's the same. And I find it interesting. And also, maybe part of my disinterest is because I can't think like that. So I like it when someone breaks it down. I can pretend it's a stance, or maybe I just don't get it. You know what I'm saying?
Okay. So tell me about, did you manage to stay sober after your first Ibogaine? Because usually it takes few times, right?
So yeah, I never had the desire to use cocaine and heroin again. I've never had
time.
After one time.
Amazing.
It was amazing. But part of my healing, what we call this integration these days, but part of my healing is I went to my grandmother's village on the island of NYHRE, which is a blue zone, and which is filled with it's also called the Red Island because there's a bunch of commies and anarchists. And and I got to see who I was.
Blue for the over 100 and red for the anarchic?
Yeah, exactly. Actually, we talked about maybe meeting there someday. We should sail there. I mean, have you been?
No, but we should try again this summer.
Yeah, let's try. So I was there. It was before people sort of come for the summer, the village emptied out, only old people, either in Athens or in Germany or States or whatever. People were working. And so I was there in this little village, my grandmother long dead. And that was an equal part of the healing because I got to see who I was and things slowed down. There was many ancestral connections during my trip, including a matriarch's voice telling me in the soil, actually the Peloponnese on my other side of my family, dead so long, the earth's gone through you, which became a mantra, dead so long, dead so long. And there was a day when I was 2 days in the village and an old lady comes walking towards me and she walked like my grandmother. I used to call her John Wayne because she would have this walk where she'd go sort of like John Wayne. This woman came up to me and she said to me, I thought she asked me who I was, but it took me a minute because my Greek's not good. She was asking me whose I was. Who did I belong to? And once I told her, she was able to place me in sort of in a cosmos, right? And she sort of, and it turned out my grandmother had baptized her as a little girl.
Oh, wow.
But that moment was sort of key for me. That whose was I? And so I was supposed to be there for a month. I spent 3.5 months there. My family kept on saying, stay. But I was burning to get back and to bring Iboga to other people. I had this desire of sort of a zealousness of the newly converted.
So 3.5 months in Greece after your Iboga session and you were still sober?
I was sober. I didn't want to drink. I didn't want to do anything. I got back to Detroit with this burning desire. I started to write again. I started writing poetry again. And I got back to Detroit. I went to work for my brother. And I started doing some stuff in the house music world there, like promoting stuff, getting creative a little bit. But I was without a rudder for a little bit. And my friend Richie Oglognik, who's the guy who sent me to somebody else instead of him, which was a great lesson, said, "Don't come to me, go to Holland," right? Which is a great lesson. He told me, I said, I want to start offering Iboga. I said, you know what, man, spend a year, get into therapy, get a fucking job, be a normal person for at least 1 year, which is a very little bit of a time. But so I did that, and I eventually um, got into 12 steps. I got into Narcotics Anonymous, even though I wasn't desired that community. It was really sort of fundamental for me. I was in the city doing it, so there was profound moments of transformation in my early days in that movement and in that fellowship. I do have my critique of disease model and all this kind of stuff, but I didn't touch another substance, including a psychedelics or anything, for I think 5 or 6 years.
Wow.
Uh, and then I sort of, I got married way too quick. And what I saw, which is a lot of people who are one addiction leaves and then it manifested in behavior, in consumption of food or sexual behavior and all this stuff. So it manifests. I mean, I was healed from this one thing, and I have a perspective, which I think what psychedelics do most of all, but I was still had a lot of healing to do and a lot of work to do on that. So I was in therapy, and it took me about a year and a half to really start to get into the Ibogaine movement, with both feet. And I did it in a very public and sort of crazy way. but yeah,
A very public, crazy way because you did that documentary.
even before the documentary, there was This American Life. There was I'd go to conferences and talk about it, and I really wanted to push the envelope on it, and I think in some of that it was misguided in a way, and certainly egoic. But I was not going to hide the fact that I was detoxing junkies, and we started a project. I guess that's maybe 20 years ago or 19 years ago, where we just passed out all these flyers at methadone clinics, and I went with Richie Oglognik, and he trained me. We tried to train other people, and we were just trying to do as many Ibogaine sessions in the summer as possible. And it was chaotic and in some places reckless, but also ultimately, pretty satisfying. But the thing I got to say is what I began to realize over the course of more than a decade doing that work was that because I was trying to replicate what had happened for me, which is not a bad motive, but it shows that our motives must be really deeply examined when you're starting to bring someone. I was doing damage. And I think the
Uh-huh.
psychedelic movement, the hype around the psychedelic movement is also damaging. The hype that this is a cure, that you can, for example, have years and years of heroin addiction and one or two or three instances of Iboga, experiences of Iboga or Ibogaine can arrest that and walk away from that, or that you can experience evil, be it sexual or abuse or participation in war, and for adventures with guided adventures with MDMA will quote cure you of and I think what happens for most people, we are far more interesting and complex and curious creatures that this formulaic approach is damaging, because people would come to me and they would not have the same results, even though there would be maybe they would start speaking to a loved one, or maybe there would be some kind of recognition of harm they've done or other people done, but they go back to using and then they think they're the ultimate failure. So I think these things, we have to be careful with these drugs.
But the feeling of cessation of withdrawal, that's quite common
It is common, but the majority of people relapse.
because they go back to their environment. I have the brother of a friend of ours that, the first time they sent to this clinic in Mexico, but then they didn't organize properly the reintegration, the aftercare coming back home. He went back, in their neighborhood with their friends using, and of course he relapsed. But then the second time they learned from the mistake, and after the clinic, they arranged for a job in a different town, completely with, without any connection with users, and that worked out, and it's still sober now 20 years later.
That's beautiful. And I got to say, if I didn't spend that time in the village, I don't know what would have happened with me. But even that, you're right, getting folks away from something, but there's no formula. That doesn't necessarily work. Yeah, but there's no formula, and it's not the fault of the person. Maybe some of it is, maybe some of it isn't. But this is the issue with harm reduction. The basis of harm reduction is that you meet people where they're at, and present them with a menu of choices. And the way even Ibogaine is being pushed right now, even harm reductionists who are advocates are not, it's still an abstinence only sort of modality. And I think we have to move away from that and start to understand that that change happens all kinds of different ways. And then also recognize that someone who continues to use chaotically is still a human being that is deserving of dignity and rights. And that dignity sort of stops at, stealing my cell phone. But up until then, we have to accept folks. So I worry about the way that Ibogaine and other psychedelics are being sort of sold. And to your point, man, it's a structural issue. There's a lot of conversation, and God bless our recognition of trauma, but the sort of animization of that, each individual has their trauma and walks around with it. When we're walking around in a structure created by an economic system that, what old school Marxists would say and old school Freudians would say, we're dealing with alienation from our species spirit, or as Marx said, species essence. Same thing, spirit, an alienation from that. So what I'd like to see, and I'm interested in doing this, is can we use these drugs not to have just personal awakenings, but can we use them as some sort of organizing tool, some sort of tools that we or create community where we can come out and have a space where we can foster that universal love, that connection that you were talking about, and then also have a serious analysis about what ails us. So, intention is important. If we just want to inject these drugs, these medicines into the existing medical paradigm, I don't see much hope for it as in terms of an agent of change.
Because the current medical paradigm is very reductionist, dealing with the symptoms mostly without addressing the cause, and not being holistic. But so that's what I see a little bit in Ibiza. It's integrating the psychedelic sitting, practice with the somatic psychotherapeutic approach, like Gabor Mate. So the psychotherapist would have the person, in practice for several months, if not years, and once with the compassion inquiry approach, where the constellation of trauma has been identified, and then they can sit down with the psychedelic. But so what is as far as what is because I know that MDMA, it's it's the last trial, should be legal if not this year, beginning of next year. Psilocybin should follow. Some state like Oregon, Colorado, they already decriminalized magic mushroom. Do you know where do we stand legally with Iboga in the States?
Iboga is still Schedule 1. So I have, my CV has the distinction of being the only person convicted of Ibogaine and Iboga in the United States. So I had a federal conviction. But it's still illegal. There is movement, but it's a far more complex drug than these other drugs, because it does have cardio toxicity, those implications, and in association with its use for detox. This is true with all these drugs, all these medicines. Like, one measurement of efficacy is, how much does it cost? And so the cost of Iboga in terms of detox would be, I think, astronomical in the United States, certainly. And so, I mean, there's some movements towards research. I happen to strongly disagree with using the Sackler um, 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 settlement money for research.
Hmm.
Because I don't feel that Ibogaine will get to the majority of drug users under the current system. I mean, look, one of the beauties, you asked a legal question, and the answer is it's still illegal. There's people working on it. But one of the beauties of psychedelics and Ibogaine in particular is how inefficient it is in terms of how much time it takes.
I see. I see.
And so I think that's the beauty of it. To walk someone through an Ibogaine detox takes a lot of attention. The way that I, work with sound and psilocybin and MDMA, I have several people maybe working with one person over the course of 10 hours. I'm here at Cardea, and we do retreats in Jamaica, but we also do ketamine sessions here. Um, but we extend it. We're not trying to get you in and out. We want this to be a 3-hour experience. Sort of we have a particular practice beforehand, and that takes a while of sort of intention setting, and then afterwards you're encouraged just to stay and journal. And so what these drugs really give us the opportunity to do is to really honor people and to hold people. And to me, it's more about space than it is about anything. One of my heroes, Sun Ra, said, "Space is the place," and that's what really interests me, brother. That's what happened when I, almost 18 years ago, I went to Gabon for the first time and was initiated into the Bwiti. I saw that the way these folks conducted a ceremony, the way they hold the space, reminded me of my experience in the punk movement and then in house music. This idea that there was a collective happening there, and that the performing arts is healing art, is at the center of the healing, and then the honoring of the person.
Yeah.
Just that in itself is the holding. I think holding is the most important aspect. Just like in the therapeutic relationship, the therapist is an artist.
Yeah.
That's why this shit about 20 years of psychotherapy in an afternoon, it's first of all nonsense. It's an insult to the art of therapy, and it's third a bad idea. 20 years of psychotherapy in an afternoon.
Yeah.
It's these relationships, and that's what really interests me about psychedelics.
Yeah.
How can we hold each other and create different containers in which to hold it?
I totally agree. That's why it's complicated. I think we'll see the new generation of therapists that will practice this psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, because the old generation of psychologists, they can't even give you a hug. You can't even like the Woody Allen type shrink. It's like you cannot have personal relationship. You cannot even have a coffee together.
No, there's got to be this blank slate. Yeah.
It has to be like no touch, no thing. Whereas the psychedelic assisted psychotherapy is all about make the client, the patient feel that that the therapist doesn't think what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. That there is that empathy. That there is this part of the reason why psychotherapy works is because you create this support system. You create this trust, so that the person with this traumatic event or PTSD can find really supported. But okay, tell us a little bit about this two business that you mentioned, the New York harm reduction.
Sure. I haven't worked at NYHRE for a couple of years, but we're in partnership with it. That organization is now called On Point, and it's the first safe consumption space in the United States. In Portugal, it's you can go and consume drugs safely. And I worked there for over a decade in Harlem.
So what do you say safe use? I mean, people can use what?
Heroin, crack, whatever they need to use in a safe space. That's one aspect of it.
I see.
I mean, there's also a medical clinic. There's also a holistic center, which I was involved in co-creating, where we provide, acupuncture and yoga and sound therapy and ritual for just folks coming in off the street. So my involvement in that has, and you helped me do a couple fundraisers for that a few years back. I haven't been involved directly in harm reduction work, but I'm starting to get back into it. The business I have now is called Cardea, Cardea. We are a ketamine space in Tribeca, but not a clinic. We're not about moving somebody through an experience. It's designed, the entire space. I got to walk you through it, bro, because you got to come and see it. It's designed by Randy Palumbo. He's the main the author of the space. I mean, this panel behind us is all made from mycelium, including this light above me here. The furniture is made from mycelium. Really a creative space. We have the artwork of our participants on the wall here. So we work with ketamine here, and then we have mushroom retreats in Treasure Beach, Jamaica, and soon in Nosara, Costa Rica.
Oh, nice.
I'm working with, we worked with Ross Ellenhorn, who's an author and therapist and sociologist. We came together with our belief that that diagnoses can be harmful. That social injury is at the core of many of our injuries. So we're not looking at people as broken, things to be fixed, but individuals that are involved in a process.
In a process.
And we the sort of the opposite of sort of a debilitating experience of mind or mood would be an opening and creativity. So art is at the center. Art, small a, capital A. We work with sound, live sound here. You know, I'm a not an official student, but definitely an admirer and a friend of Alexander Tanus, who I think is the leader in the world. We owe so much to him around the healing art of sound. So we use live sound. Also, working with the DJ and artist Juan McLean, who is also a sound practitioner and ceremonialist. So we do ketamine sessions here, and we do retreats. We're also, something I'm really excited about, we have a non-for-profit called the Further Fund, spelled like the bus, and I got to write it down because I'm dyslexic, Futhur. And what we're doing with that is we're interested, this brings me back to Harlem, we're interested in providing psychedelics sort of to support the healers. So to support the people that are day in and day out working to make change, and the stress of that, and the feeling, and also open up a space for grief, frankly, which I think psychedelics can be a beautiful creating space around for that deep grieving. So our first venture into it, we've been going for about 7 months. We're working with people who work directly with homeless folks, with overdose prevention, in drop-in centers, in homeless shelters. That was our first cohort of folks that came through. So people are dealing with vicarious trauma on a daily basis, reversing overdose deaths, or maybe seeing folks after they've OD'd or their family members. So people in the harm reduction world. We've also started working with teachers who work in special ed. We've also started working with, beginning to work with climate change folks. So the idea is that we're providing space here for, we're doing a whole push for climate change activists and scientists to use psychedelics as the way not only to heal and to a place for resting, but also to reinvigorate and come up with new solutions collectively together. So we intend to do some retreats with climate change folks, but right now, I think we have 71 people in that program who are working on the front lines. I call it veterans of the war on drugs.
Wow, wow, wow. Amazing, amazing. Good work, Dimitri. Well done. But let me ask you a little bit about ketamine. So, how do you administer that? Injected?
Right now, we may be moving to IM, but right now we're working with nasal.
Uh-huh.
And we like it because we're always concerned about the hierarchy. And so it's self-administered. And, you know, the place is like a work of art. And so it's self-administered either in a group setting. We have an incredible group room here, or individually. We have curated tracks that were made by Juan McLean. And then we also do live sound and space holding.
But so, what kind of people comes to a ketamine treatment? Usually, they say depression, or is it a little bit of everything?
People often come in with, we honor people's narratives, right? So that we might have an opinion on the overdiagnosis and a DSM diagnosis, but we honor the narrative. So people are coming in with where they're describing depression, they're talking about anxiety, deep sorrow, and also the feeling of stuckness. And man, just like MDMA, I was suspicious because I was a plant guy. But after having a personal experience, I think that these are amazing substances. And basically, we're getting to the same point of getting offline and getting to I believe the word I use is getting to a place of theos, of a holy place. So people are coming in with depression and with, what they call treatment-resistant depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, that type of thing. Yeah. Which
Because
is different from the work that we're doing in the retreats. Retreat. I don't believe a retreat is a place to address deep trauma. It's a retreat. So that's more about, we don't need a diagnosis, but you have to come through a doctor to see us here. And yeah.
I see.
And our approach, just to say, and Ross has written about playfulness. Our approach is that it's deeply rooted in art. I mean, I've had my experiences, and I'm deeply grateful for my experiences in Gabon. I went 6 times and 3 levels of initiation. But what I came to realize is that well, I'll put it like this: we're not from the Amazon. I mean, at least I'm not, and a lot of people, or the bush, right? And we're not from Johns Hopkins, but we honor the traditional healers and their wisdom around the working with such medicines. And we know that we are medically supported, and we honor a reductionist way of viewing the world. But the thing in the middle is our culture. It's the culture of art. I'm in Lower Manhattan right now. We're more from the dance floor and the podium, the poetry podium, and the gallery, and what we've learned in our culture, which I think is an incredible rich history that we have of art. And so that also includes the therapeutic arts. And so, and also the improvisational quality of healing. So that's the thing about when I do ceremony, it's just like playing Funny Valentine, right? Miles or Coltrane, they've got a form, and they're riffing inside of that, just like a good therapist is improv, just like we're doing now. Yeah.
Beautiful, beautiful. And it's the first time that I really have a sense to what extent this new movement of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy is now taking different flavors, the more medical, the more shamanic, and you are putting forward this program more on creativity, which I think is a beautiful program. I totally get it. But I read somewhere this ketamine usually needs to be repeated every few years.
The model is now, and I have clinicians. I'm working with clinicians here. We have really talented clinicians. We also really like working with, if people have a therapist, which we encourage, working with a therapist. But to say that folks can come in for a series of 6 and notice a significant change, but checking in again is necessary. I don't think there's cures to being human.
Yeah.
And dude, what happened with me is the same thing that happened with MDMA. I was sort of against it, and then I found myself taking MDMA with someone I trust who is a master at sound, and my mind was blown, right?
Yeah.
And then the same thing with ketamine. Ketamine I knew as a party drug, but or a club drug. But I had this opportunity to work legally, and I worked illegally and was convicted for doing so back in the day. And I thought, okay, this might be an opportunity. Let me see. So I started to do ketamine with really great musicians and space holders, and to see it. I was like, and I was just doing it like sort of as an experiment. But like the MDMA, which was an experiment, I was at a particularly bad point in my life. The ruminations still come.
Yeah.
I'm still the same schmuck as Lenny Bruce said, right? And so there was one time in particular where I just couldn't turn off the voice, the self-critical voice, and I was in a lot of pain. And I just, actually I was doing a bunch of ceremonies for other people, and I had a day off, and I had the experience, and I noticed that the ruminations went down 80, 90%. And so what I do now for me is every it might be every 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, I simply check in and I can notice the volume turn down. Doesn't work like that's not one size fits all. Everyone got to find the relationship, just like Prozac or any other drug. You find your relationship with it. And, ketamine, just to be frank, can be problematic for some folks. So that needs to be considered. But I believe that, it's what we're seeing here and other people are seeing is a course of treatment and then a check-in for some people. And some people it doesn't work for. It doesn't have an effect. I'm fortunate that I can use it as an ally 3 or 4 times a year.
Yeah, yeah. But so, what was your personal experience with folks using ketamine? How long ago did you start? Can you see some result?
I just started a couple of years ago, and I had a lot of prejudice about ketamine. But what I saw is that particularly the way people are held, I think is really important because there's an opportunity to create meaning out of it, working, for example, working with people on the front line of harm reduction who are seeing folks come in on a daily basis. I'll give you one example. Some people coming in on a daily basis who are dying, overdosing, going to prison. And I had that experience working with very poor people in the harm reduction world, where you just watching a lot of death. A young woman who runs a drop-in center in Brooklyn for drug users. There was an overdose Memorial Day, which is once a year, and she didn't know how she was going to go and do it because she couldn't and be there for her clients because she was in such grief, and she was able to have room to grieve within the experience, right? So that, and then be able to go back in and do that work. But we've seen folks, the same type of thing you see. It's not technically a psychedelic, but man, I mean, I know it works in a different part of the brain, but to me, you can journey. I've seen people have direct ancestral experience, or maybe just a clinical sort of because of that dissociative quality to be able to be observer and observed at the same time. And that coupled with sound, with vibrational instruments, a deepening of the experience, and then an ability to like sort of process it with us here and then go process it with your therapist, with your rabbi, with your 12-step group or whatever the hell it is, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and I think we're giving people material. We really have problems with the scooping out, this idea that you just scoop out suicidal ideation from the brain or something. We're not sure this is so much of a skull-born, symptoms. I mean, we're trying to deal with people as human beings and unique. But we're seeing really great results, and I'm kind of impressed with it. And I didn't think I would be. I had prejudice against it.
Yeah. No, I feel you. I get you. I mean, you have this, like what would you say? It's like the opposite of formulaic, like intuitive.
Dude, you got it. We do a training program here, and our training is not to be formulaic. And by the way, what's his name? I'm forgetting his name. French philosopher Foucault. Foucault had the medical gaze, the gaze of the doctor in the medical establishment, right? But there's also a shamanistic gaze, right? And they're very similar. They're like, there's something wrong with you. We're the experts, and through us we will fix the brokenness. And so it's not about that. You hit it. It's not a formulaic practice.
Yeah. I totally get it. As you know, we are a big fan of Gabor Mate. And ultimately, he was telling me that all these people that were drug addict in the suburbs of Vancouver, it was like almost 100% childhood abuse, and all these people, what they really needed to be seen. They needed to I think this expression that I mentioned already, this idea that it's not what wrong with you, but it's what happened to you, and to give drug user and addict dignity and respect, and I feel you. I mean, I know you for many years, and I love how you transfer your leftist activism from politics to healthcare, how you connected immediately with this harm reduction, and how you wanted to you were in Greece and you wanted to go back and give Ibogaine. I mean, you have this drive of helping other, which I think might be the secret of the success of your center, because people feel it, say like this guy cares. He might not have, the little balance and the little dose and the little questionnaire and that happened then and this happened that, but you just create a safe space around creativity, with Randy Palumbo art and this DJ music, and definitely, I want to come.
Come, bro. Come. Please, please come. What you're talking about is you're describing the harm reduction ethos. To work day in and day, I would detox people of Ibogaine and then go work in Times Square for 3. I was working 7 days a week. I'm a bit of a nut, right?
And remember,
yeah.
to come to Harlem to help.
Yeah, we're talking with 2 organizations. One is On Point and one is Action Lab, about setting up training and setting up psychedelic centers in Harlem and in Brooklyn by training the workers who are, because they already know how to hold space. Harm reduction, people are walking in, they might be right out of prison, they've already been dejected by their family, and your job is to welcome them.
Yeah.
And to say it's good to see you. That's the main job. The main job is to welcome them as a family.
And feeling it.
Yeah. And that's why it's a spiritual practice. Harm reduction is a spiritual practice, because some days I don't want to welcome them as they are. I want to slap them and say, quit smoking fucking crack. But that's like when you're meditating and you get away from the mantra or the breath. And you say, and then you just bring yourself back. This is where it is. We love you. Here's what we can do when you're ready. If you're ready, we love you.
Yeah. I'm thinking, like recently I saw on the press, this lady gave $1 billion to this Bronx school to allow free tuition. Did you see that? Anyhow, imagine someone would give $1 billion to the harm reduction led by Dimitri Mugianis, and you can help it. You can start this center in all the state capital, creating this environment of creativity and support.
I don't have a retirement plan, so that would be awesome. but we would do ceremony on a weekly basis in Harlem for 10 years, and it was incredible. The amount of creativity people would have, and it's part of the work we're doing with Further Fund. So if people are interested, it's a tax deductible charity, and $1 billion would be nice. Your lips to God's ear, man.
Amazing. Listen, man, thank you so much. I'm coming to New York for my son's graduation, and I want to come and try the center and try some ketamine with you.
I'll give you a diagnosis for sure, bro. I got a few of them. All right,
okay, listen, I think you mentioned all the websites. We're gonna put them on the show notes.
Okay.
Is there any? We have the
Cardea.
We have the Cardea website. You mentioned a couple of non-profit. Maybe can you mention the website again?
Further Fund. I'll have Jill send you that, and then there's my website, which I just do consultations and stuff. So I'll put those up.
Okay, perfect. If Jill can say that, we'll put them on the show notes.
Okay, awesome.
And one last thing, if there's one of our listeners that might not be in heroin, but people that even with cannabis, I struggled with addiction of cannabis for 20 years. Yeah. But so which advice do you have to young kids that they are into the prison of addiction, that they feel that they're not living to their potential? What advice do you have for them?
I would say, first of all, that you're not broken, that what you're doing is an attempt to live, an attempt to heal, an attempt to explore. So in that there's not one way to do this, that there's many ways to do this, and it's your journey, and we're here to support that. And at the same time, we're at a very dangerous point in the experimentation. So it's not like, even though I lost a lot of people when I was young, the death rates are higher, and actually the cannabis is different. So acknowledge that what you're doing was the best way that you could do it at the time. And then there are other ways of living. And that's all I can say. Even as a coach, I don't have a formula.
Yeah. But this is like, you're not broken. Don't lose faith in yourself. you know.
Yes, yeah, and yeah, and that's the main thing. Look, I can I have a problem with the example, like the shining example, uh, but I'll say I was in psychosis for so many years. I was done, and I'm not. And I think that however you see that, I believe I believe everything you were talking about scientifically is divine. I believe our interactions are divine. I believe that there is a divinity, and I actually believe that we can change because individually and collectively. I don't think that we're not hopeless. The planet's not hopeless, and you're not hopeless. You're a valuable being, and and you can get there, man. That's all.
Amazing, amazing. Amazing. Thank you for your energy and your optimism. And we'll check online in a few months again.
All right, my brother. God bless.
Thank
Love,
you
I
very
love
much.
you. Take care, bro.
Ciao. Love you, man. Ciao,
You too.
ciao.
Koka sunarai sunarayanti. 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 Koka sunarai sunarayanti.